Welcome, seekers of truth. Before we begin, I invite you to subscribe and leave a like, not just as a gesture, but as a commitment to expanding your understanding and embracing deeper knowledge. Your support fuels this journey into insight and wisdom. Let us proceed. Have you ever felt as if you were the only one awake in a city that never sleeps? Have you had the sensation that even amid laughter and conversation, there was a void no one seemed to notice? Have you looked at yourself in the mirror and thought, maybe I am more distant from the world than I should be? Nietzsche said, "He who fights monsters must take care not to become a monster himself, and if you gaze for too long into the abyss will also gaze inside you." But what if that abyss were the silence of our own company? We live in a society that expects us always to be connected, always available, always smiling in selfies while inside we carry labyrinths. A world that glorifies extroversion and regards silence with suspicion. A world that rewards the quick word but scorns the deep pause. And so for those who need air before diving into crowds, the world becomes a suffocating place, a stage of noise that pushes us to wonder if something is wrong with us when, in reality, perhaps we are merely attuned to frequencies others have learned to ignore. This video is not for those who live comfortably in the noise. It is for you who feel like a stranger in social gatherings, for you who prefer the sound of a book's pages turning to the murmur of a party, for you who have asked yourself whether your way of being is a flaw or a deeper calling. Today we will walk the dark hallways of solitude, not as an enemy but as a messenger. We will speak of the invisible dangers that arise when isolation becomes desperation in disguise. And above all, we will try to understand when being alone is a refuge and when it becomes an invisible prison of the soul. Prepare yourself. It will not be light, but perhaps it is necessary. You are in the room. There are voices around you. Laughter, glasses clinking, side conversations. Too many people, yet inside you the emptiness is deafening. It is curious how the noisiest silence is not the one where no one speaks, but the one where no one listens. You say something. Someone responds with a polite smile. Another changes the subject. You feel you are there only by protocol, present in body, absent in essence. It is in that moment that loneliness ceases to be geographical and becomes existential. The loneliness of one who is among people but outside any connection. It is cruel because it is not obvious. There are no applause or concerns, no one notices, and therefore no one helps. Have you ever tried to explain that to someone? To say that physical presence does not resolve the emotional abyss? They look at you with pity and tell you that you should go out more, meet new people, take a dance class, maybe adopt a dog. But what you feel is not a lack of occupation. It is a lack of meaning in the occupations they propose. And then comes the discomfort because you do not hate people. You do not want to isolate yourself in a solitary monastery. You simply do not fit. You do not know how to feign interest in empty conversations. You do not know how to keep the smile when your mind is questioning everything. You do not know how to live in this social theater without losing parts of yourself. And so you begin to withdraw, not out of resentment but for survival, because pretending to be someone sociable when your soul is imploding with fatigue is a kind of slow suicide. Albert Camus wrote about a man who did not cry at his own mother's funeral. They called him a monster. But what if he simply felt in a different way? What if his pain was so deep that not even his body knew how to express it? The world does not tolerate well those who feel differently. Have you noticed how everything seems made for extroverts? Open spaces, noisy offices, obligatory gatherings. Even seeking medical help demands facing a queue, a reception desk, a room full of strangers. And when you say you prefer to be alone, they think you are ill. It is as if silence were a symptom of something that must be fixed. But what if silence were in reality a scream, a true plea for space, for air? Some people need noise to feel alive. You need silence to remember that you are still here. But there is a problem, a subtle but devastating problem. When you begin to distance yourself from everything that does not understand you, you also lose the opportunity to be understood. It is a paradox. You flee to protect yourself, but that flight makes you invisible. And then the cycle begins. You withdraw, no one notices. You confirm that no one cares. You withdraw more and more. Little by little, you are not just alone. You are an emotional ghost. The pain is not merely being alone. It is being alone and still having to pretend everything is fine. It is having to smile on the company anniversary, to respond, "I'm fine," when everything is crumbling inside. It is exhausting, and sometimes it begins to seem easier just to disappear. Not physically, but emotionally. You stop trying, stop explaining, stop expecting anything from others. You shut down. But here lies the danger, that solitude, which starts as a shield, can become a prison, and sooner or later you will forget where the key is. Because the more time you spend away from people, the more strange the social world becomes, and then solitude starts to change you. At first it is silence, then it is judgment. You begin to look at others with distrust, with anger, with that sense that no one will ever understand. It is at that moment when solitude stops being a refuge and becomes a sentence. And when that happens, something inside you dies in silence. Yet there is still time, for to recognize this is already the first sign of life. At first, withdrawing seems a lucid choice, a gesture of self-preservation. You simply want peace, distance from the obligation to smile when inside you are broken, distance from conversations that feel like empty rituals, distance from the constant pressure to explain yourself about everything. Time becomes a relief, like removing armor that has grown too heavy. At last you can breathe, and in the silence of your room, in the calm of solitude, something inside you seems to realign. You hear yourself again. You remember who you were before trying to fit in, and then you think, perhaps this is where I belong. But there is an invisible line between retreat and exile, and it is easy to cross. What was once a choice becomes a habit. What was protection turns into a wall. You begin to avoid, then to fear, until you simply give up. You give up on explaining, give up on trying, give up on believing you can be understood. And the most dangerous part is you start to convince yourself that being alone is always better. Even when your chest aches, even when silence turns into an echo, the flight becomes a prison. Not when you hide from others, but when you start hiding from yourself. You stop missing others not because you do not feel, but because you become accustomed to absence. And that pain has no words left to describe it. It is a numbing of the soul. Here lives the great deception. To believe that is strength, that depending on no one is maturity, that not caring is wisdom, that being an island is a sign of evolution. But it is not. It is fear. Fear of going back out and being hurt. Fear of trusting and being betrayed. Fear of being seen and rejected. You begin to romanticize that supposed strength. I am better alone. I do not need anyone. The rest are too superficial. Yes, I am deep. Yes, I feel more. Yes, the world seems made for noise. But be careful, for pride can disguise desperation. It is easy to confuse distance with dignity, but sometimes distance is just a pretty name for resignation. It is when you choose silence, not out of love for peace, but out of fear of chaos. Carl Jung said, "Who looks outside dreams, who looks inside awakens." But he also warned that when introspection becomes a flight from the world, the shadow is born. And that shadow begins subtly. You start to interpret others' gestures as threats. You believe every closeness hides an intention. You see irony where there is genuine interest. You see disdain where there is only distraction. It is your mind trying to protect you, but instead of protecting, it isolates you. And isolation feeds a dangerous narrative, that you are incomprehensible, untouchable, irreparable. You begin to build mental castles where you reign alone. But each stone of that castle is made of undigested grudges, each tower of accumulated disappointments. And from up there, everything seems small, distant, hostile. The flight has become a prison. You locked the door, hid the key, and threw away the map. But there is something no one tells you about emotional prisons. They do not need bars, just the belief that escape is impossible, and then self-exile begins. Not imposed by others, but chosen, fed, and sustained by yourself. Because it seems easier, safer, inevitable. But it is not. You were not born to live in that cave. You only needed time, but too much time in darkness makes us forget the sun exists. And sometimes the first step to leave the prison is to remember you were the one who built the door. Music. At first, silence seems safe. It is there you hear your own voice, free from the world's interference. But the longer you stay in that quiet, the more the mind begins to distort. Too much freedom starts creating monsters out of unresolved pieces of the past. What was reflection becomes rumination. What was introspection turns into paranoia. You begin to recall every conversation in which you felt ignored, every uncomfortable glance, every time someone did not reply to your message, and you start weaving a theory out of it all. It is no longer about that specific person. It is about people in general. They do not care. They are superficial. They do not understand me. And there arises a belief not based on objective reality, but fed by accumulated pain. The mind seeks patterns, that is what it does. And if it is wounded, it will only... If you've made it this far, I want you to know that you're a warrior. And by staying on this path, you'll connect with your higher self and become a better person every single day. So if this resonates with you, go ahead and hit subscribe. Give this video a like and tap the bell so you won't miss any of these insights that are here to help you grow. Thanks for being part of the Being of Knowledge family. Find patterns that validate that wound. Do you believe people are cold? You will ignore gestures of kindness. You believe no one cares. You will filter out signals until only those that prove you right remain. And then, without realizing, you begin to build a distorted inner world where everyone is superficial, where no one cares, where you are the only conscious soul in a multitude of emotional zombies. It is tempting, I know, because if you believe the problem lies in others, you do not have to deal with your own fragilities. You do not have to admit you miss someone. You do not have to accept you still long for connection. And at that point, the dark pride of solitude is born. I am different. I am deeper. I am too special for this world. But beware, for every belief of superiority is actually a defense against the pain of feeling inferior. You start telling yourself you are better alone, that you need no one. But at night, your chest tightens and you begin to lie to yourself like an emotional alcoholic, swearing you only drink socially while inside you are drowning. And the most dangerous thing is that there are places that feed that pain. Forums, groups, communities of wounded, isolated, bitter people. And in that sea of shared resentment, radicalization arises. People who gather to hate the world, to validate their rancor, to feed the belief that they alone see the truth. Thus are born the extremists, the misanthropes, the fanatics, the conspiracy theorists, all with one thing in common. They once only wanted to be heard, but instead of finding healing, they found mirrors that only amplified their pain. And then the shadow grew. Solitude ceased to be silence and became a cry of war. Schopenhauer said that solitude is the destiny of all exceptional spirits, but he also said the more intelligent a man is, the more he will suffer, because the more you perceive what others do not see, the harder it is to belong. And that non-belonging can turn into rage. Rage that disguises itself as lucidity, as intellectualism, as I am more aware than you, but which at its core is only a cry of pain poorly translated. And that is why it is so dangerous to spend too much time with your own thoughts without external mirrors. Because without another's gaze, you begin to believe everything you think, and not everything you think is true. Sometimes it is only fear, sometimes only exhaustion, sometimes only a heart trying to protect itself from what it still does not understand. The problem is not being alone. The problem is when, in solitude, you stop seeking and start judging. The human mind needs contact not for approval, but for perspective. Without it, it darkens. And in that darkness, even the mirror distorts the reflection. Music. There comes a point when the pain of solitude is no longer just absence, but becomes identity. You are not only alone, you are the lonely one. You start carrying that label like an invisible tattoo, and there arises the dilemma: how to return, how to reconnect without betraying yourself, how to open up without being devoured by a world that always seemed too superficial. The answer is not simple, but neither is it impossible. The first step is to understand that you do not need to dissolve yourself in others to get close to them. You do not have to laugh at what does not amuse you. You do not have to feign interest in parties that only drain you. You do not have to force yourself to fit into spaces where your soul shrinks. You only need authenticity with strategy, like someone learning to swim in a sea of noise without drowning in the current. That means choosing who to spend your energy on, choosing when to say yes and when to honor the no, choosing where there is a chance for truth. It is not about quantity, it is about depth. A single friend who truly understands you is worth more than 20 acquaintances with whom you cannot be yourself. And yes, those connections exist, but they are not found on shop windows. They are revealed little by little when you have the courage to show your inner world before demanding the other understand it. There is something magical in allowing yourself selective vulnerability. That is where real encounters dwell, the ones in which silence between two people is not awkward, but restful. But to reach that point, it is necessary to review your certainties. Not everyone is superficial, not everyone is cruel, not everyone will disappoint you. That generalization is what keeps you distant, and you deserve more than to live inside a fortress of sad assumptions. Reapproaching the world does not demand you deny your nature. On the contrary, it demands you know it so well that you know where it fits and where it does not. You can be someone who prefers listening to speaking, someone who needs pauses, who values depth, who does not tolerate falsehood, yet still live a life in which real connections are possible. But for that, it is necessary to break the myth of absolute purity, the belief that if a connection is not perfect, deep, almost telepathic, it is not worth it. Sometimes a simple gesture is already a beginning, a sincere good morning, a meaningful glance, a conversation that does not save the world but warms the day. You do not need epic experiences every day. You only need crumbs of truth so as not to starve emotionally. And more than anything, you need to be willing to adjust your expectations without giving up your essence. Because balance lives between the firmness of being who you are and the flexibility of receiving the other as they are. That requires courage. The courage to step out of yourself even when you're afraid. The courage to try one more time even after so many frustrations. The courage to accept that the world will not fully understand you, but that does not mean it cannot offer genuine moments of beauty. Jean-Paul Sartre said, "Hell is other people." But he also said, "It is through the gaze of the other that we recognize ourselves." And in that paradox resides the truth. You need solitude to find yourself, but you need the other to see you completely, not to be saved, but to remember you are still alive. So allow yourself to leave the cave, even if only for a few minutes. Talk to someone, even if your voice trembles. Risk disappointment knowing the alternative is stagnation. Life is not made only of certainties, but it is in imbalance that the soul grows. And yes, it is possible to live between worlds, your rich, deep inner world and the imperfect but possibility-filled external world. You only need to learn to cross that bridge without rushing, without guilt, and above all, without losing yourself. Solitude has two faces. One heals, the other corrodes. One is fertile silence, the other an echo of abandonment. What defines each is not the time we spend alone, but what we do with that time. What we believe about ourselves when no one else is watching. You are not broken for needing peace. You are not weak for feeling exhausted after a day full of interaction. You are not strange for desiring depth in a world that lives on the surface. But neither are you immune to the danger of losing yourself in your own defenses, because when the mind is wounded, it is ingenious. It builds castles but forgets the doors. And then you start calling fear strength. That is why this conversation was more than reflection. It was a mirror for you to see yourself, to recognize yourself, and perhaps, just perhaps, to begin to open the windows. I know how it feels. I know because I lived it. There was a time when I avoided every invitation, canceled plans at the last minute, said I was busy or tired. But the truth was, I was afraid. Afraid of feeling out of place, afraid of not knowing what to say, afraid of looking into someone's eyes and realizing I no longer recognized myself. It was in that abyss that I understood something. The problem was not the world, but the version of myself I let out of the house. Today, I am not someone who throws himself into crowds, but neither am I a prisoner of my own silence. I found rare people, deep conversations, real moments, and it was only when I stopped trying to fit in that I began to belong. So thank you. Thank you for staying until here, for sharing this silence with me, because somehow, perhaps, we have never been so close. And now I am going to do that moment every video asks for, but in my own way, of course. If this video touched you even a little, let the algorithm know there are still people who feel. Give it a like, comment, subscribe, or do nothing, but think about this before you sleep. Now, 2 videos are appearing on your screen. One will take you to a place inside yourself you have been avoiding. The other might show you that you are not the only one feeling what you feel. But I will not tell you which is which. Choose with your heart or with your shadow. She also knows the way. If this message resonated with you, if you felt something within you awaken, don't stop here. Subscribe to the Being of Knowledge and become part of a community of silent strategists, of awakened minds who no longer fall for masks. Like this video if it brought you clarity, and share it with those who also need to open their eyes. Because true power begins with one decision: to never be the same again. Thank you for watching.